In 1997, I was living in Detroit, renting a small apartment off Gratiot Avenue near Eastern Market. I was 22 at the time, working nights stocking shelves at a grocery store, which meant most of my free time was during the day. I didn't have much money back then, so instead of a car, I relied on the bus system or bummed rides from friends. Music was my main way of killing time, and I always carried a cassette player around when I could. Mine had recently broken, so a friend of mine named Marcus loaned me his Sony Walkman. He handed it over one afternoon while we were hanging out, and I remember him laughing and saying, "Don't lose it. That thing's my baby." When I got back to my place later that night after work, I sat down on my bed and checked the player out. There was already a tape inside. It didn't have a label, just a black Maxell cassette with worn edges. I figured it was just one of Marcus's mixes, and since we had the same taste in music, mostly hip-hop and R&B, I thought I'd give it a listen. I grabbed my cheap foam headphones, slid the tape in, and hit play. At first it sounded normal enough, muffled background noise like the tape had been recorded over multiple times. But then I realized it wasn't music at all. It was someone talking. The voice was a man's, low, calm, and very deliberate. He wasn't speaking into the recorder directly. It sounded like he was further away, like it was recorded on the sly. I caught a few words, things like "she doesn't know yet" and "wait until after." I froze for a second, thinking maybe it was just part of some radio drama or something taped over. But the more I listened, the more I realized it didn't sound staged at all. I rewound the tape a little to make sure I hadn't misheard. This time I listened more carefully. There were long stretches of silence, with faint shuffling or a car passing in the background. Then the man's voice would come back, almost like he was having a conversation, but the other person wasn't picked up by the mic. I heard him say things like, "She walks home around 9, and the window doesn't lock right." That's when my stomach dropped. It didn't sound like random chatter. It sounded like someone planning something. I took the headphones off for a minute, just sitting there staring at the Walkman. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe a prank tape or something Marcus recorded for fun. But it didn't sound like him. Marcus was loud and animated. This voice was calm, methodical, almost cold. I debated whether I should just stop listening, but curiosity got the better of me. I pressed play again, fast-forwarded a bit, and picked up where the voice returned. The recording switched locations at some point. I could hear the faint hum of a television, maybe from a neighbor's apartment, and then muffled footsteps. The man whispered something I couldn't make out, then said clearly, "Tonight." That word hit me hard, and I actually yanked the headphones off again. For a few minutes, I just sat there in silence, realizing I might be listening to someone's private plan to hurt another person. The creepiest part was that I didn't know if this was something old or something that hadn't happened yet. The more I thought about it, the less I liked the idea of just ignoring it. If what I heard was real and not some weird art project or prank, then someone was in danger. I decided to call Marcus to ask about it. When he picked up, I told him I found a tape in his Walkman and asked if he'd been messing around recording something. He swore he hadn't. He said he only ever used it for music and didn't even own blank tapes. That's when I started feeling legitimately nervous, because it meant the tape must have come from somewhere else. I went back to the Walkman and played the last few minutes again, this time with the volume lower, like I was afraid someone might hear. The voice muttered an address. I froze. It was a street about 10 minutes from where I lived, Antietam Avenue. I recognized it instantly. Then there was the sound of a door creaking open, followed by footsteps, and the tape cut off suddenly, almost like it was stopped mid-action. I didn't even finish listening. I ejected it and just stared at the cassette like it was something dangerous. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I shut my eyes, I kept thinking about someone out there with a recorder, documenting things before they happened. I never told the police because I was scared of sounding crazy, and I didn't want to explain how I had the tape in the first place. Marcus asked for his Walkman back, but I lied and told him I lost it. The truth is, I kept the cassette locked in a drawer for years, too unsettled to throw it out. The worst part? Sometimes I wonder if anyone ever reported something happening on Antietam Avenue that night. I never had the courage to look. Back in 1997, I was living in Rome for work. I had just turned 27 and was working long shifts as a night manager for a logistics company based near Termini Station. Because of the hours, I carried a pager. Most people I knew either had a pager or a bulky Motorola cell phone, but the company only paid for pagers. It wasn't unusual to get late-night messages from drivers. But one week, I started noticing something strange. A number I didn't recognize kept beeping me. No message, no callback instructions. Just the number flashing across the small green screen. At first, I ignored it. I figured it was some kind of error or maybe someone mistyping a number. But it kept happening, sometimes 3 or 4 times a night, always the same number. I finally decided to write it down and try calling it from a payphone on Via Cavour. It rang a few times before someone picked up. No one spoke. I just heard muffled breathing, then a click. That was when I realized it wasn't an accident. 2 nights later, after another shift, the pager buzzed again. Same number. This time, instead of ignoring it, I called right away. The line didn't even ring. It picked up instantly, and a man's voice with a heavy accent said, "Camera 22, room 22." Then the call cut. I stood there holding the receiver, my stomach turning. I didn't know if it was a prank or something serious, but curiosity started getting the better of me. I couldn't get the words "camera 22" out of my head. The next day I asked around at work, half joking about weird pager calls. One of the drivers, an older guy from Naples, warned me not to mess with it. He said if someone was paging me on purpose, it meant they already knew who I was and where I was. That idea unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of checking it out. A few nights later, after finishing my shift around 2 a.m., I gave in to my curiosity. I followed the address the pager number eventually led me to, a cheap roadside motel on Via Tiburtina. The neon sign buzzed as I walked past the mostly empty lot. I could have walked away right then, but I didn't. Instead, I went inside. The clerk barely looked up when I asked for room 22, just nodded down the hall like he'd been expecting me. The hall was dim, doors lining both sides. When I reached room 22, the door was cracked open just a few inches. I stood there, listening. No sound, no movement. I pushed it slightly, and it creaked wider. The lights inside were off, but there was a faint glow coming from a television left on in the corner, the screen flickering gray and blue. On the bed sat a small black pager, the exact model I used for work. It buzzed once, showing my number across the screen. I froze in the doorway. There was no reason that pager should have my number unless someone had programmed it to. I picked it up, and right as I did, the door shut loudly behind me. My heart jumped out of my chest. I spun around, but no one was there. Just the sound of the latch clicking into place. I yanked it open again and stepped back into the hallway, my hands shaking. I went straight to the front desk and demanded to know who had rented the room. The clerk finally looked up at me, calm as ever, and said it had been paid for in cash. No name. I tried pressing him for more, but he just shrugged. When I turned to leave, I noticed there was another pager sitting on the counter, identical to mine. The clerk slid it into a drawer without a word when he saw me notice. That's when I walked out and didn't look back. The next morning, I brought the pager from the motel with me to work. Before I could say anything, my supervisor called me into his office. Sitting on his desk was the same pager I'd picked up. He said nothing about where it came from, only told me to be more careful with company property. I didn't argue. I just nodded and left, and that was the last time I ever answered a page I didn't recognize. I grew up in a small town in Kansas, the kind where everybody knew everybody, and the high school only had a few hundred students. In 1997, I was a junior, and most days felt predictable. Classes, football practice, hanging out with friends at the Sonic off Main Street. That spring, we had a few teachers out on maternity leave, so seeing substitute teachers wasn't unusual. Most of the time, they were people from around town, or grad students from nearby Wichita State who just wanted some extra money. One Monday morning, though, we walked into English class and saw a man we didn't recognize. He wasn't on the younger side like most subs we had. He looked closer to late 30s, maybe early 40s. He had on a button-up shirt that looked a little wrinkled, and instead of introducing himself like most substitutes did, he just told us to open our textbooks to a chapter and start reading quietly. He didn't write his name on the board either, which I thought was a little strange. At first, nobody really cared. It was just another easy day with a sub. But as the period went on, a few things stuck out. He kept staring at certain students for a little too long, like he was memorizing faces. At one point, he asked a girl sitting near the front what her last name was, even though he had the class roster sitting on the desk. When she hesitated, he leaned in and said, "It's okay. I just want to get to know you better." She laughed nervously, but I remember thinking it didn't sound like a joke. By the second day, everyone in school was talking about him. The sub was now covering not just English, but also a history class, and even one of the freshman science classes. That was weird in itself, because normally subs didn't move around like that without being assigned. Still, he carried a clipboard everywhere, acting like he belonged. I started noticing he never sat at the teacher's desk like the other substitutes. Instead, he would walk slowly up and down the aisles, stopping behind people's chairs and looking at their papers. Once, during history, he leaned over my shoulder and asked what street I lived on. I kind of laughed it off and said, "Why?" He didn't answer. He just smiled faintly and walked away. That set off alarm bells in my head, but I figured maybe he was just socially awkward. Later that afternoon, I overheard one of the freshman teachers quietly asking the secretary at the front office about him. She wanted to confirm his credentials, The secretary looked confused and said she didn't have any paperwork for a new substitute that week. I remember that moment clearly because the teacher's face went pale. That's when I realized this guy might not even be supposed to be here. The next morning, I walked into the building and noticed a couple of police officers standing by the office. Word spread fast. The man who had been subbing wasn't listed with the district at all. He'd just shown up Monday, dressed the part, and nobody had questioned him because he looked the age and carried himself like a teacher. Apparently, when the real substitute arrived that day, the principal put two and two together and called the cops. I remembered instantly the way he'd asked me what street I lived on and how he'd hovered behind people as if he was memorizing their handwriting. Some students later said he'd asked them similar personal questions: what bus they took, what neighborhoods they lived in, things like that. The scariest part was that he'd been walking the halls freely, with access to every classroom, for almost 3 full days before anyone stopped him. The police escorted him out during first period. He didn't resist. He just kept his head down and smiled faintly, the same way he had in class. Later, I found out he had no teaching background at all. He wasn't even from our town. He'd been drifting through different schools across Kansas, slipping in unnoticed, until someone finally caught on. No one ever told us exactly what he wanted or why he was doing it, but that almost made it worse. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the thought that he'd been standing over my desk, asking me where I lived, and that if the timing had been a little different, he might have tried to follow one of us home